Welcome to this first exclusively online event of the Martin Center. My name is Vit Novotný, and I will be moderating this discussion. This online briefing also serves as the launch of a new Martin Center paper, Lifting the Integration Veil, Outcasts from Islam in Western Europe. This paper by Tommaso Virgili has now been published on the Martin Center website, where you can read it. This online event is an experiment. You can see me and our two speakers, but we cannot see you. We have done tests for the technology behind this Facebook streamed discussion. We tested it, but please bear with us if there are any glitches along the way. The event will be short, only 45 minutes. You, our audience, can ask questions of our discussants. Please do so by posting your questions in the comment section below the live stream on your Facebook page. My colleagues, who you cannot see, but I assure you they are there, will select one or two questions from you and send those questions to me during the discussion. Please also give us any feedback on the event in the same comment section below the streaming screen. Let me now introduce our two speakers, Tommaso Virgili and Ruud Koopmans. I will start with Tommaso. He's a research associate at the Martin Center, where he was a visiting fellow until October 2019. He is also a visiting fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy. His main areas of expertise are Islam, radicalization, individual liberties, and integration. Ruud Koopmans is the director of the Department of Migration, Integration, and Transnationalization at the Berlin Social Science Center. He's also a professor of sociology and migration research at the Humboldt University. He focuses on immigration and integration policies, ethnic inequality, ethno-cultural conflicts, and religious fundamentalism. Without further ado, I would now like to invite Tommaso to present the main thesis of his paper and also to briefly explain why this topic is important. Tommaso, you have 12 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Vit, and thank you to all the Martin Center staff for setting this up in these tough times. The main goal of my research was to assess the integration of Muslims of immigrant descent in Western Europe through the prism of their level of tolerance towards outgroups, meaning those group of people that, because of inner characteristics or life choices, do not share the prevalent ethos of their communities of belonging. To do so, I use qualitative studies, quantitative surveys among Sunnis in different European countries, and mostly interviews with Muslim human rights activists, victims of human rights abuses, refugees that obtain the status because of being outgroups in their countries of origin. The first pillar of my research was to assess the meaning of integration. Integration is actually a concept as abused as undefined in policy debates. There are mainly two main aspects of integration going on there. One is the socioeconomic aspect, the ability to access a good job, housing, to navigate the bureaucracy of the country, and so on. The other theory of integration is mainly hinged on a values-based component. I think none of those can go without the other. The values-based and cultural component is, in my view, particularly important if understood in its minimal sense of creating a common denominator of respect of everybody, respect based on observing the rule of law and individual liberties of others. Now, this is to be seen in an individual frame. Multiculturalist theories tend to focus on groups, but by doing this, by giving recognition to groups and their rights, they forget about the people within those groups that are exposed to a sort of tyranny of the majority in many cases. That's how I come to my main focus, the level of tolerance towards outgroups. Now, different researches out there, some of them, like Professor Koopmans, made in a cross-country way, thereby using the same methodology and the same research questions, show that there is a significant cleavage between the majority of Muslims of immigrant descent in Western European countries, which are prevalently Sunni Muslims, and the rest of society, but also other immigrants not coming from the same background. Where do we see this? We see these with the usual suspects, gender equality in all spheres, both in the family and outside the family, the rights of homosexuals, the anti-Semitism, apostates or atheists within Muslim communities. The level of tolerance towards these groups is in many cases very low and comparatively lower than other groups within our societies. Now, my aim was to understand the causes of this, or to try to do so. One possible cause is the so-called reactive religiosity. According to these theories, Muslim communities are discriminated in our societies, and therefore, as a reaction, they developed a stronger attachment to a supposed ethos of origin against the Western mores. This theory gives us contradictory results. According to certain studies, actually, a higher level of education or a higher social status brings about a stronger acceptance of liberal democracies. Other studies show the very opposite. I have no time here to go into details, but I want to stress one point, that the main problem of all these researches is the fact that they fail to explain why, all conditions being equal, so all social conditions being equal, even the fact of belonging to a minority or of coming from an immigrant background, nevertheless, Sunni Muslims appear as less integrated and less acceptive of outgroups than other minorities, such as Alevi Muslims or Ahmadis, and in general than other non-Muslim groups, even of immigrant descent. Therefore, I thought it was important to investigate the religious aspect. Now, as a matter of fact, all researches show that for Muslims of immigrant descent in Europe, the attachment to their Islamic identity is particularly important. These also translate not merely in a cultural aspect, but also in downright religious piety. And what we also find is that this religious piety, in many cases, comes with fundamentalist tenets. Fundamentalism defined according to three main parameters: belief in only one possible interpretation of the sacred scriptures, belief that this is not modifiable, and belief that this interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah should supersede secular law. Another statistical connection is the fact that the higher the level of religiosity, the higher the intolerance towards outgroups. Therefore, there is this link between a high level of religiosity and intolerance towards outgroups. At the same time, it's not the only possible link. We should take into consideration the cultural aspect as well. In my research, I mentioned an example. I'm Italian, and I mentioned a study conducted by a communist homosexual intellectual, Pasolini, in the 60s, that showed that the average view on this kind of matters in Italy in the 60s was not very different from what we find now among Muslims. What is the fact? The fact is that culture and religion are so much interrelated. If you think that in the countries of origin, religion shapes the law, religion shapes society, religion shapes morals, that it becomes difficult to distinguish and separate one aspect from the other. I'm now going briefly to the final part of my research, which is policy recommendations. I would even call them like common sense recommendations from a certain point of view. I divided them into three clusters. The first concerned society as a whole. Our society are guilty in many cases because they have not empowered individuals with the rights they were constitutionally entitled to, and authorities have failed to protect vulnerable individuals. I can tell one of the anecdotes that I received from a transgender woman of Moroccan origins, that upon filing the umpteenth complaint to the police, was told by the police themselves, "Madam, you should change neighborhoods." And the reply was, "What then? In 50 years, shall I change my country?" Now, this is not acceptable. Of course, the entire society is not only upon the police that needs to have the means to act. So the entire society at all levels needs to create the conditions to do so. And here we come to the second cluster of my presentation, of my policy recommendations. It's necessary to create the right milieu. And this must be done by promoting cultural inter-exchanges between different communities in our societies. Now, both during this research and during a previous one that I conducted at the European Foundation for Democracy on integration of refugees, one of the main findings we got by interviewing whether refugee supporting organizations or refugees themselves, hundreds of them actually, was that you cannot teach integration. Integration is something that you need to transmit by a living example. To do so, two conditions are needed. You need to have individuals that are bridge builders. On the one hand, that they understand the culture of origins of non-Europeans, but on the other hand, that have interiorized the liberal democratic framework and its merits. This, of course, applies in certain contexts, such as integration courses, but society is much wider than that. Therefore, another key point is to disrupt ghettos. Ghetto neighborhoods are those environments where certain cluster of society find themselves confined with little exchanges between each other, and this perpetuates a certain ethos among the groups themselves that is imposed upon all individuals. I suggest certain ways to do that. Of course, it's not easy in a liberal democracy, but there are ways to go into that direction. In these clusters, I also inserted a key thing, which is protect Muslims from discrimination. This is absolutely key. An individual in our society must be welcomed irrespective of their color of the skin, religion, gender orientation, gender, and so on. It's important at the same time to stress that discrimination is against individuals, it's not against ideologies. And here we go to the third clusters of my recommendation, which is disrupting the link between Islam and radicalization. So Islamism, the ideology built upon Islam, or the tenets of Islam, which are incompatible with individual rights and the rule of law, not only can, but must be criticized. Therefore, the concept of Islamophobia, which is promoted mainly from Islamist actors and sometimes embraced by leftist actors, is to be rejected, because anti-Muslim hatred against individuals is a different thing. No discussion on any ideology whatsoever can be or should be censored in our societies. This goes hands in hands with empowering reformists within Islam, liberal actors within Islam. Until now, our societies, both at the level of NGOs, the media, the European Union, member states, have actually largely empowered Islamists. This has to change. This has to change when it comes to funding, when it comes to employing Muslims in education programs, in prisons, in integration programs. We need to empower liberal Muslims, and I try to define certain parameters to understand what I mean with liberal Muslims. Finally, we should not forget that no ex-Muslims are a group that is often forgotten in all our discussions. They are scared because they are often threatened, and it's absolutely necessary to give them visibility and to empower them as well, to recognize their existence. The final group that I want to mention is refugees that are escaping their countries because of their religious views, sexuality, and so on. They are escaping what Bernard Lewis would call theocracies, in the sense of government of religion. And it's absolutely key that we protect them, both because it's a moral imperative, but also to counter all those views that are essentializing Muslims. They come from Islamists, but they also come from the extreme rights that view all Muslims in the same group. This is not the case. Those refugees that are coming here for this reason are craving for the freedom we enjoy, and this is absolutely imperative that we protect them. So this is in a nutshell my research, and I look forward to additional questions.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. Please mute your microphone. I think you have done it. Just to our viewers, just apology. We have some issues with the cameras. Please bear with us. Hopefully you can hear us, and that is important. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Koopmans. Ruud, if you would kindly provide your comments on the points made by Tommaso. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Vit. And thanks a lot to the Martin Center also for the opportunity to comment on Tommaso Virgili's paper, which I enjoyed reading a lot, I have to say. I think it's a very important paper. It's also original in the sense that Tommaso has a legal background, but actually uses an empirical approach to tackle the subject, and does so by giving voice to voices within Muslim communities, to outgroups, as he calls them in Muslim communities, that are not normally very present in the public debate. And Tommaso has referred already to the groups that he discusses. And in the presentation, of course, in the short span of the presentation that Tommaso gave, that aspect of the report has maybe not been so prominent. But I think that's also for our viewers. It's important that there is a lot of material, actually statements by ex-Muslims, by homosexuals, transgenders, minorities within Muslim communities, which provide an extremely important and critical view on how also non-Muslims deal with problems in Muslim communities. I just want to, as an example, just read you one example of a transgender woman of Muslim origin, who says about, this discussion about Islamophobia and whether one is allowed also as a non-Muslim to criticize discrimination within Muslim communities. She says, "It is not a matter of stigmatizing a community. It is about criticizing an ideology. Are we perhaps stigmatizing Germans when we talk about Nazism?" So it's just one example of people getting the floor in this report that one doesn't hear so often. I agree with many of the policy recommendations. I agree with all of them. I would maybe want to highlight one point where I think where I would maybe lay the emphasis a little bit differently. Tommaso mentioned that we would need to facilitate reformers within Muslim communities more strongly. But I think what is very important is that we, and if I say we, I talk especially about the mass media and also about policymakers. We should stop facilitating conservative and fundamentalist currents within Muslim communities. Official representative organizations, which often claim to speak for Muslim communities, often don't even have a numerical basis to actually substantiate that claim, and who are very present in public debates and basically reinforce a very conservative, if not reactionary form of Islam. And I live in Germany, in Berlin. And we have seen that recently in this country, in the discussion after the terrible racist murders that took place in Hanau a few weeks ago. And of course, it's very understandable that media and policymakers in such a case want to give voice to people from immigrant communities. But it was very striking how these events were immediately captured by conservative Muslim organizations, by DTIP, for instance, which is the branch of Diyanet, which directly belongs to the presidential office of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, by Milli Görüş, another Turkish organization, and by the Central Council of Muslims in Germany, which among its members counts a direct representative organization of the Shia regime in Iran. It counts an extremely nationalist Turkish organization among its members, and it has several members that are close to, at least to the Bundesverfassungsschutz, or the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, to the Muslim Brotherhood. So these are very conservative fractions within Islam, which were all over the mass media. They were invited by policymakers to talk about how to deal with racism. They were the ones in all the talk shows. And the Muslims that Tommaso is talking about in his report, they were completely absent from the discussion. And I will give you one example which shows how terribly wrong policymakers are handling these matters right now, also from Germany in the aftermath of Hanau. Policymakers wanted to show signs of solidarity with immigrant communities, which was somehow shortened to Muslim communities. And here in Berlin, the senator responsible for internal affairs and the head of the Social Democratic faction in the local parliament went to visit a mosque. Now you would say that's very nice, but this mosque was a mosque of DTIP, of basically the Turkish government, of a very repressive regime. Moreover, it was a mosque that has as its name Şehitlik Mosque, which means the martyrdom mosque. And in the courtyard of that mosque are two graves in marble and with golden letters on it. And they are the graves of two of the main perpetrators of the genocide on the Armenians in the aftermath of the First World War. So basically, we have two high-ranking politicians from Berlin here expressing solidarity with immigrants and Muslims in a mosque that celebrates mass murderers and represents a very conservative form of state Islam in Turkey. And I think that shows that there is a lot to gain by stopping facilitating the wrong kind of Islam. And that is possible by not granting such organizations legitimacy, by, for instance, visiting them or inviting them into policy talks or in the Islam conference in Germany, for instance, by not giving them a platform in the media to the extent that they're giving a platform now, and also not letting them profit from all kinds of state subsidies, because these organizations have their hands in all kinds of pots of radicalization programs, integration courses, etc. So all the, the necessary work on, transmitting values, creating intercultural contact, which I all agree with Tommaso, it's very important. But if the organizations that are actually organizing this and that get money to do this are actually the most conservative branches of Islam in Europe, then of course the effect will be counterproductive. So this is in no way in contradiction to anything that's in the report. It's just emphasizing a particular part of the conclusions.
Thank you very much, Ruud. I have a follow-up question to both of you. I'm going to bring in a question that came from a member of our audience, Piotr Maciej Kaczynski. And the question is this: we're talking about the problem of religious conservatism, making it really difficult for those communities to be integrated into our liberal democratic systems. How widespread that problem is. So in my own experience, the Muslims I meet, they are often more secular than I am. and I rarely meet the people who you are talking to in your research. I'm sure that's only an indication of my limited social circle. But if you could comment on that, and perhaps also assess the number of what you identify as liberal Muslims. Are they numerous enough for the official bodies to serve as a contact point? And perhaps we'll start with Ruud, and then we'll go back to Tommaso. Ruud, please.
Yeah. Yeah, it's of course a very good question. I think to begin with, I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between conservative or strong religiosity and religious fundamentalism. The two are not the same. Religious fundamentalism is a politicized form of conservative religiosity. So conservative Muslims who live their conservative, strong religiosity in their private life and do not have claims on the public sphere, that do not bother other Muslim and non-Muslim groups that prefer another type of religiosity. They are, in a sense, they might not be liberal, but they're not problematic in a liberal democracy. Problematic are the groups that actually have political claims and that do have hostility towards outgroups. So with that qualification, I've done research in different European countries on the extent of religious fundamentalism, and that varies somewhat from country to country. We're talking for instance, in Germany, about 30% of the Muslim population. In a country like Belgium or in France, we're talking about half of the Muslim population. So it's in that order of magnitude, 30 to 50%, depending on the country. Then there is, of course, the other 50 to 70% are more or less half-half, consisting of people who are strongly religious, but not in a politicized fundamentalist way, and truly either very liberal, secular Muslims, or people who are Muslim in name, and they would still say, if you ask them, I'm a Muslim, but they hardly practice their religion. They maybe practice Ramadan, and maybe they eat halal food, and maybe for some festivities they would go to the mosque, but that's about it.
Thank you, Ruud. Tommaso, would you like to come in on this question?
Yes, actually, I'm very happy about these questions because it allows me to remark something, that the most vigorous defenders of secularism are to be found among Muslims themselves. So Muslims that are either secular or that belong to minority and that have been themselves oppressed or they risk oppression are those that better understand this logic of individual rights I was speaking about. Now, here we have an additional problem. I mentioned before, and Professor Koopmans mentioned before, the aspect of empowering, funding, and so on. We have the problem also of takfirism, of the accusation of apostasy that doesn't only come from a tiny circle of Salafists, as someone believes. If you are a reformer, you endure a lot of risks, and people that I interviewed for this study or whose sources I've read, they are even scared to express their reformist idea of Islam. To the extent, this happens to the extent that, according to some ex-Muslims that I interviewed, it's even counterproductive to speak about liberal Islam because they are so niche that they could not bring about a change. Now, I understand this reasoning. At the same time, I would like to stress that we actually need to give them more voice in order to produce a virtuous circle where their voices are amplified. So I understand the preoccupation of ex-Muslim not to whitewash Islam through attaching to it certain labels such as Islam is peace, Islam is moderate, or no, I understand what they mean in going to the concreteness of individual rights, but I still think that we need to empower those reformists in the way that I spoke about before.
Thank you, Tommaso. I'm going to bring in some questions from the audience to a larger extent than I was planning to, but we are getting some good questions. Let me throw them on to you right now. I have a question because it's a follow-up question from Roland Freudenstein. Which organization of rebel Muslims in Europe do you consider having the best chances at being really influential and gaining traction among a larger number of Muslim immigrants? Who of you would like to perhaps try to answer this question?
Shall I go first? Yeah,
Go ahead.
Roland Freudenstein's question is, of course, a very important one. It's also a very difficult one to answer. Let me just take the example of Germany. There are, of course, a number of liberal Muslim organizations. The problem is they tend to be very small, and they tend to get a lot of opposition from mainstream Muslim organizations. There's the Liberal Islamischer Bund, so the Liberal Islamic Federation, which, however, is an organization that consists of a couple of hundreds of members. They have a few mosques, etc. So they're not completely irrelevant. Some of their spokespersons are also, visible in the public debate. So that is an opportunity to give that organization more visibility. At the same time, it certainly is even less representative of the larger Muslim community than some of the mainstream organizations. But I think it's also the point that Tommaso makes about integration and giving rights is in the end an issue of individuals. And in that sense, it is maybe also the wrong question to ask, which organization should we then alternatively talk to? No, we should maybe alternatively talk more to individual Muslims and give individual Muslims who have differing views a view on talk shows, in policy debates, in conferences that we organize, instead of always looking for a representative organization. Islam, Muslim communities are much too varied for any organization to be representative anyway. So a more individualized approach is maybe a better one than searching for the representative liberal Muslim organization.
Yes, I couldn't agree more on this. And actually, this is at the same time a strength and a weakness. Now, to answer Roland's question, again, I could mention individuals and small organizations gravitating around those individuals, or individuals that are from academia and do not have any organization whatsoever. In my research, I'm very happy to mention them. I make reference very much to Professor Elam Manea, to Ludovic Mohamed Zahed, who is a homosexual imam in France that set up a liberal mosque. I could mention Seira Natesh in Germany that set up another liberal mosque. We have Marzia Masjidi, who is in charge of an organization promoting gender equality among refugees. So we have many individuals and small organizations doing that. Of course, we have a problem that the smaller you are and the more individualistic you are, the less you can impact also on the vast majority of your target audience. And here again, there is, of course, there is an issue which is very much connaturated to the fact of being a liberal. A liberal, compared to a fascist, a communist, an Islamist, is a maverick par excellence. It's difficult to trap him in a certain group and keep him there. But at the same time, we have again the problem of security. Those liberal mosques I was mentioning, they are controlled 24/7 by security forces because they are constantly under threat. So how can you advertise or make them more accessible to the wider Muslim community? It's very difficult. The issue of funding also. If you don't give funding to a certain organization because it's considered too small to be representative, that organization will never grow up. So yeah, we have many vicious circles there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. Very briefly, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to react because I think the two topics are to some extent interrelated. Tommaso mentioned that many of these liberal organizations and mosques actually need police protection. And you mentioned the example of Sharon Atesh and her mosque in Berlin. The reason why that organization needs police protection is that when the mosque was opened, there was a massive intervention from Turkey by Diyanet, who issued issued a statement saying that Sharon Atesh was a sympathizer of the terrorist Gulen movement and that this mosque had no right to call itself a mosque. There was also a fatwa from Al-Azhar in Egypt saying that this mosque had no right to call itself the mosque and that the prayers were invalid, etc. And it was then that massive threats started coming in and she needed police protection. Now, this Diyanet is the same organization that controls DTIP in Germany, that is present in all these discussion tables, in all these policy circles that receive subsidies. So, you know, what the state in Germany, and that same is happening in other European countries, is actually talking to, subsidizing and legitimizing the very same organizations that make the life of liberal Muslims completely impossible. And that has to stop.
Tommaso, you can speak, but only one sentence, please, okay?
Now, just to mention that I'm very happy that Professor Koopmans mentioned Al-Azhar, because this is another case of complete obnubilation within Western societies and governments. Al-Azhar is often mentioned as a bulwark of moderation, and actually there are many fatwas of death against apostates that come from this very famous Islamic university in Egypt. So it's very good to remark who are real friends and who are not.
Thanks. I will now. I'm going to leave out all the questions that I prepared. We're getting good questions from the audience. There's another one coming. I think it's going to be probably our last question of this event. How serious is the issue of Muslim conservative fundamentalism, I think in its political form, when compared to Christian or other fundamentalism? It would seem from recent events that the security of European society is more at risk from the latter, from the Christian fundamentalism. Tommaso, would you like to come in first?
Yes, I would like to comment, first of all, distinguishing between two issues. My research was not, actually, in my introduction, I stressed that I'm not dealing with terrorism, because I believe that radicalization starts way before than violence. So extreme conservatism that is infringing upon the rights of others not necessarily will provoke an outburst of violence. It may or may not. And even if there is violence, not necessarily that violence will assume a terrorist form. So it's important to distinguish between the two and to stress that my research has nothing to do with terrorism, but with ideologies that might lead to terrorism in certain cases, or that in any case make the life of people, of some people, impossible. Having said that, if I have to reply to these specific questions, I would say that this applies more to the United States, maybe, because if you read, I don't know, all the Europol reports on violence in Europe, Islamism remains the main cause of deaths because of terrorist attacks. This is not to deny the extreme right or possible fundamentalist Christianity. All of them are to be kept under scrutiny. The very difference is that with the extreme right, for instance, we have the knowledge of the risk. Therefore, nobody would have in its mind to empower a neo-Nazi and putting him in an integration class. With Islamists, it's not quite the same thing. We still think that someone who is radical in his ideology, well, could still be a bridge builder. This is very dangerous and can provoke many consequences.
Thank you, Tommaso. Now, Ruud, for last comments, please. You can tackle this question.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about this question also. maybe the most important comment I have is that I always find it only of very limited use to point to other forms of radicalism and fundamentalism and outgroup hostility to somehow relativize the topic that we're talking about. The fact that we also have in the United States Christian fundamentalists, that we also have a problem with right-wing extremism, doesn't make the problems within Muslim communities, the problems that the outgroups that Tommaso writes about in his report, any less pressing. So it is not, we don't have to make a choice between tackling the one problem or tackling the other problem. We need to tackle them both. Having said that, you can still ask the question, of course, which one is more important? I mean, on a worldwide scale, I mean, the answer is very, very clear. If you look both at the international research on attitudes and research on minority rights and violations of minority rights, minority oppression. If you look at terrorism also, it is very clear that Islamic fundamentalism is a much, much more serious problem than any kind of other religious kind of fundamentalism, and also a much worse problem than right-wing extremism in terms of the number of deaths, for instance, as Tommaso mentions. Of course, recently, especially in this year, especially in Germany, we have seen a strong rise in extreme right attacks, and that's also a very serious problem. And I'm sure that's a serious problem that you will be dealing with in other reports and in other discussions. But we're now talking about a problem that is important in its own right, and it cannot be relativized in any way by pointing to other problems which are also important.
Thank you very much, Ruud and Tommaso, for your answers, for your input to this debate, online debate. Unfortunately, we are nearing the end of this event. I want to thank all our viewers. We have received more questions than the ones I was able to pose. Because of the experimental nature of this broadcast, I want to apologize that we are not able to answer more questions. Nevertheless, I'd like to invite you, our viewers, to leave feedback on our Facebook page. And I want to encourage everyone to read the paper by Tommaso Virgili, which is published on the Martin Center website. Last word, the Martin Center will continue with these online events in the near future. So please stay tuned, and thank you for your attention. Bye.